right. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to our third iteration of the Collective Courage Conversation series presented by the National Coalition Against Censorship, also known as NCAC. My name is Elizabeth Larison, and I am the Director of Arts and Culture Advocacy at NCAC, and I'll also be moderating today's event. The National Coalition Against Censorship, if you haven't heard, is an organization that was founded over 50 years ago in an effort to advocate for principles of free expression in the United States, with a special focus on protecting youth-free expression and artistic freedom. At NCAC, our arts and culture advocacy is the only national initiative of its kind solely dedicated to defending artistic freedom in the US. We've been doing this for 26 years through censorship case interventions, where we provide direct strategizing and support to artists of all kinds, curators, cultural institutions, theater directors, publishers that might be navigating censorship pressures. So, small PSA, if that's you, please contact us through our censorship report form, and please feel free to share it with your peers and colleagues. We also do our work through advocacy leadership, wherein we lend our expertise to weigh in on key censorship issues in the news, and through resource creation and dispersion, and through events like this one. Our goal is always to empower people, the artists, the curators, the arts workers, as well as the cultural institutions that make arts and culture in the US what it is. Last summer, NCAC declared in a collectively written statement co-convened by the Burroughs Center for Art and Politics and signed by over 1,200 individuals and cultural institutions that cultural freedom demands collective courage. What started out as this collectively authored statement has expanded now into this series of events which focus on different challenges and strategies for meeting the moment and retaining our collective courage and commitment to cultural freedom in the US. If you haven't seen or signed the statement yet, check out a link that is or is coming into the chat, and please consider signing it and sharing it with peers and institutions that you care about. And if you have ideas for future talks, you can send them our way. We have a place on our website taking suggestions. This is a movement that will continue to grow and will continue to provide resources, educational opportunities, and information about related events as time goes on. Today's talk will look thoughtfully at the censorship pressures of the past year and consider a question that many of us working in arts and culture at some point have found ourselves asking. Which way do we move forward when ideological pressures threaten our very institutional values? This past year, there's no doubt that incursions on artistic freedom have been relentless. From executive orders aimed at reshaping federal policies relating to race, gender, and US history, to its declaration that museums across the country are the last remaining segment of woke, the executive branch of the United States has made plain its expectations on the country's cultural sector. When such expectations stand to directly or indirectly influence funding, leaders of cultural institutions have difficult decisions to make. And many leaders that I've spoken to in this past year have found themselves at times unsure of how to assess the risks of standing out and resisting the demands of the current administration versus the risks and losses enmeshed with compliance. But the way forward, and what I'm hoping we all can really see today, isn't always framed in binary terms. Leading us in today's conversations, I'm very pleased to welcome Anne Burroughs, who is the president and CEO of the Japanese American National Museum and its National Center for Preservation of Democracy. She is an internationally recognized leader in the field of human rights and social justice. She is chair of the International Board of Directors of Amnesty International, the immediate past chair of Amnesty International USA, and a former chair of Amnesty International's Global Assembly, its highest decision-making body. She is also on the board of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation, and her lifelong commitment to racial and social justice was shaped by her experience as a young activist in her native South Africa, where she was jailed as a political prisoner for her opposition to apartheid. For over 25 years, she has worked with leaders, organizations, and networks in the US and abroad to promote racial justice and a rights-based culture. Thank you for joining us, Anne. And I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Yomaira Figueroa-Vázquez, who is an Afro-Puerto Rican writer, teacher, and scholar from Hoboken, New Jersey. She is professor of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino studies and is the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, known as CENTRO, at CUNY Hunter. She is author of the award-winning book, Decolonizing Diasporas, Radical Mappings of Afro-Atlantic Literature, and the forthcoming book, The Survival of a People. Her published work can be found in Hypatia, Decolonization, CENTRO Journal, Small Acts, Frontiers Journal, Hispaniophila, Contemporanea, Dialogos, and Feminist Formations. A first-generation high school and college graduate, Dr. Figueroa-Vázquez is passionate about mentoring underrepresented and first-generation students. She earned her BA in English, Puerto Rican and Latino Studies, and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University, and her MA and PhD in Comparative Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. Finally, we also will have brief commentary from NCAC's own Lee Rowland. Lee is the Executive Director of the National Coalition Against Censorship, where she oversees NCAC's direct program work, legal and government advocacy, and public education. Lee has extensive experience as a litigator and professor. Before coming to NCAC, she was a First Amendment litigator for 2 decades, and she has also taught courses on free expression at NYU Law and CUNY Hunter College's Human Rights Program. Thank you all for being here. First off, I would just want to say that this past year, I've had the distinct pleasure of getting to know both Ms. Burroughs and Dr. Figueroa-Vázquez through their fierce leadership in this tumultuous time. And I've invited them to speak today because I find them incredibly inspiring and courageous, and I'm just so pleased to have you both here. To start things off, I just want to, welcome you, Anne, to tell us more about the Japanese American National Museum, how you've calibrated pressures from this past year, and how you've responded.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's so good to be in conversation with you and Yomaira, as well as Lee. And, it's good to have, and greetings to everybody who's joined the call. And I was just so thrilled by your invitation. We were an early signatory to the NCAC's statement on cultural freedom requires collective courage. And it really is, for me, it was such an incredibly powerful statement because it encapsulates so much of what all of us have felt and, what all of us know that, know how we have to show up in, at this moment. So, I thought I would start off by just talking a little bit about the museum. You see it behind me on the screen, our beautiful museum. Because it really is sort of at the heart of the sort of valued-centered approach to the way that we've responded to the current situation and the way that we do all of our programming. So we're a cultural history museum. We're known as JANM. It's Japanese American National Museum, but the acronym is JANM, J-A-N-M. So we're a cultural history museum. We're located in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, and it's the oldest surviving Japantown in the country. We're a very proud Smithsonian affiliate, so also feel the pressures that the Smithsonian, we sympathize enormously with the pressures that the Smithsonian is under at the moment, but we're also a center for civil rights and the arts. And we were founded very specifically to preserve and share a history that is both specific to the Japanese American experience, but also central and quintessential to the American story. So, most of you on the call probably know this, but in 1942, following Executive Order 9066, more than 125,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 3/4 of whom were American citizens, were dispossessed, forcibly removed, and incarcerated without due process in America's concentration camps for the duration of the war. And it's no accident that our museum, our campus, is located where it is, because this was the place where tens of thousands of Japanese American families from Los Angeles were actually forced to board the buses that would take them on to incarceration. So, we see this plaza behind me. Of course, the museum, the building is new, but, we see this plaza as being one of those ground zero points in the civil rights history of this country. And, we exist because our founders understood something that was fundamental. It's not just, we weren't founded just to preserve history or the artifacts or the stories. But really, it was really that if history and culture is not actively preserved and interpreted, it can so easily be shaped by external forces and it can so easily be erased. History, culture can be erased, or it can be forced to yield to censorship. So, our founders, it was as much about preserving history as it was also to an obligation of history and to an obligation to ensure that what happened to Japanese Americans never happens to anybody else. And that sort of critical sort of civil rights birthing has been so much part of our DNA. If we could move to my first slide, this is a slide. It's echoes of history. It's both a program at JANM, but it's also a framework for our work and specifically how we've responded to the moment that we find ourselves in. Although, of course, the moment is kind of stretched out now, but certainly how we responded, immediately after the inauguration in 2025. And for us, really, it's a framework of how we've operationalized our values. So it's also very much linked to a statement that our trustees came out with literally within 2 weeks after the Trump inauguration. It was a very powerful statement that reaffirmed JANM's commitment to defending democracy and civil rights, preserving memory as resistance, and also standing against racism and xenophobia. And I should also say that we were the first museum in the country to come out with a powerful position in standing up to what we knew was coming. And, for the longest time, it felt as though we were the only museum. And during that time of paralysis and fear, immediately after the inauguration, it was a couple of months before other museums also stood up. But there were many reasons why we did this. Obviously, it was the existential moment, but it was also because in 1942, nobody stood up for Japanese Americans when they were incarcerated, apart from the Quakers and I believe it was one ACLU chapter in San Francisco and a relatively small handful of people. So we felt a tremendous obligation to be able to stand up, not just for other museums in the field who we knew didn't have the same luxury that we had in order to be able to do this, but also to be able to stand up for the communities of color and particularly immigrant communities, because, for our trustees, it was deeply personal. Their parents were immigrants, and it felt that their own history was under attack. So it was important for us to be able to give voice in a way that others couldn't. And we knew also for, arts institutions, for cultural history institutions, for many of them, just even during that time of fear, even business as usual felt like an act of courage. And we felt that we wanted to be able to support that and, provide a voice for those of them who may not be able to. So, Echoes of History is, as I said, it's both the program at JANM, it was a symposium, but it's also very much a framework of how we look at our work. And the first program that we did on this, that we specifically called Echoes of History, was at the beginning of this year. And it was a symposium where we brought together artists, academics, experts in democracy, globally, nationally, and locally, to really look at the rise of authoritarianism and what that meant for us in our country and what that meant for cultural institutions. But it also reflects a core belief for us, that memory is not passive. Communities around the country have always used memory as an act of resilience, as a way to preserve community, as a way to preserve culture. But in moments like this, when it feels that memory is under attack, when history is under attack, when culture is under attack, memory becomes an act of resistance, because holding on to that memory is really an enormous power that we are able to wield, and we feel that it's incredibly important that we don't give up that power. It's also, this was a program that we did through our Democracy Center. We have at JANM our National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, And we've been extraordinarily fortunate to be able to have this because we've been able to bring people from diverse backgrounds to come together to talk about the about race, about identity, about the fragility of democracy, to talk about social injustice, but also as a way where we can bring the lessons of history into conversation with the present and the future, and actually use that understanding of history to spark civic engagement and activism. So, I think that, because of the pressures that we're seeing today, it sort of feels enormously important that we have been able to do this work. Because of the pressures that we're seeing today, the pressures on, freedom of thought, on open inquiry, on the ability to question dominant narratives, we know that it's not isolated and that there is a very specific and very broad assault on the civic space. And I think that the quote that Elizabeth made at the beginning about museums being, the last, segment of work, it's very, very much a deliberate strategy. And, within the assaults on on the civic space, cultural institutions, museums, art institutions are directly within that space. And certainly for us at JANM, we see our work at the museum as being a critical part of, the civic infrastructure of democracy, because we operate at that intersection of freedom of speech and freedom of association. We need to be able to have that kind of freedom in order to be able to preserve evidence, to hold memory, to hold culture, but also to create, critically importantly, to create spaces where people can encounter, they can encounter that complexity rather than propaganda. And I think that that's also one of the reasons why museums are being challenged, why the cultural space is being challenged, because it's not just simply a disagreement over interpretation. It's really a deliberate effort to narrow that space in which interpretation, in which conversation, in which exchange of ideas can occur. We see history is questioned, history is being erased, scientific fact is being dismissed, culture is flattened, it's being homogenized. And also, and I know that we'll talk about this, I'm sure we'll talk about it later in the conversation, but, federal funding is increasingly being used, as leverage, but also as a way to punish cultural organizations and museums. And I think that, it's sort of so apparent that it's sort of classic, it's classic authoritarian playbooks, because, authoritarian movements the world over understand something that I think is really quite essential, that, before they can control the future, they have to be able to control the past. And in order to be able to control the past, they have to create this narrative that once, a nation was unified and strong, but, somehow it's become weakened by sort of internal and external forces, and that only they have the power to restore that. So, it's something that's very real, and I think there's an enormous obligation on all of us to be able to stand up for that and to hold our truths and to hold our memory and to hold that power. And if we move on to the next slide, what we see is a composite of three images. The one is, so it's three moments and it's the same place. The image in 1942 is an image of what our plaza looked like, before our museum was built. And it's, as I said earlier on, it's where Japanese American families were forced to line up to board the buses under military guard that took them onto the incarceration. And then in 1942, this is an image that was taken during the Los Angeles uprising. And this shows the militarized response to civic unrest. This is just feet away from the museum, and this was on the day that we opened to the public. And then, of course, 2025, the images that we're all so familiar with, we've seen them across the country. And this was a day when 75 armed and masked Customs and Border Patrol agents invaded our campus. And it was during that time when Los Angeles was a military occupied zone, and it also happened on the day when Governor Gavin Newsom was speaking at our Democracy Center about the fragility of democracy and talking about the importance of redistricting. So I think that, even although these images are separated by decades, they're also very, very deeply connected. And I think that they reveal something that is often difficult to see in real time. But I think that they also show how closely memory and power are linked. And each moment reflects a different manifestation of state authority, of public fear, and of institutional response. It reflects for us at JANM the continuum of our birthing, which started in this moment of incredible injustice when Japanese Americans were incarcerated without due process. 1942, 1992, when we opened the museum during this time of civic unrest, it changed the trajectory of who JANM was, and our founders really thought about how we could help to build bridges, but also how we could celebrate the ethnic and cultural diversity, not just of the city, but across the country. And it really was a seminal moment in museums in this country because we were the first museum to do this. And it really was the model for how museums could be responsive to their communities. And then, of course, in 2025 is really kind of demonstrates this moment that we find ourselves in now that does require us to stand up and to be counted when civic space is narrowed and directly under attack, and particularly at this moment when, and you see again, across this continuum of, how fear is mobilized, how communities are targeted, how authority expands, and how institutions are tested, and how we stand up. How we show up in these moments. The other thing for me that these three images show is this kind of continuum of how racial injustice is a thread that runs through American history. And certainly for an institution like JANM, it's enormously important that we stand up, that we show up, and that we resist this. And then if we go to my next slide, this is a slide that shows the Am I Next project. It was a collaboration that we did with the California Community Foundation, which has been an enormously important public art project. So at night, the faces of immigrants, people who've been detained, kidnapped off our streets, and deported, they're projected across public buildings in Los Angeles. And they're huge, they're large, and you can't avoid them. What we've done at JANM too is integrate images of people who were incarcerated in 1942 to show that continuum. And the important thing about this is that, they're not just statistics, they're people. And the questions that they pose, the central question that they pose is actually very, very simple. And that's, if one community can be targeted, who's next? If one person can be targeted, who's next? And we know that, all of us, to some extent or another, are immigrants, either immigrants ourselves, as I am, or children of, or grandchildren of immigrants. So that question, am I next, doesn't belong to one group, but it belongs to all of us. And, certainly for us, at JANM, it's been an incredibly important project for us to do, because I think that it reflects another dimension of the pressures that we're discussing and how we show up being responsive to the communities in which we exist, and why museums are so critical to the civic infrastructure of democracy. This is the last slide in the deck, but there was another but we can keep it up because I think it's really important. But what I will just talk about a little bit is just some of the ways that we've responded. I've talked about some of the programs, but I also want to talk about our Scrub Nothing campaign. And it's really against this backdrop of what I've been talking about is, we know that during this time of increased scrutiny of cultural institutions, there was this clear expectation, certainly from the Trump administration, that the field would adjust and that it would narrow, language would be softened, interpretation would be revised, and also content would be removed. And at JANM, we took a very, very deliberate decision, as I spoke in the beginning about our trustee statement, and that's that we would scrub nothing, that we would not alter our exhibitions, we wouldn't revise our interpretation, and we also wouldn't adjust our language to align with any kind of political pressure. And the chair of our board was actually on national television and talked about, JANM will scrub nothing. So it became this meme. We created this T-shirt around it, but it also became a very powerful rallying cry because when he went on national television, it was in April of last year, and literally within 10 days, we had raised an enormous amount. It was almost $400,000 from people across the country some who we had no relationship with. And it was in response to the scrub nothing idea, but it was because we had had significant funding rescinded, and it meant that there was important educational programming that we were doing at JANM that we couldn't do. So, it's I know that I'm sure in the discussion we'll talk a little bit more about, the issue of funding. And certainly for us, for the trustees, we talked about that, and we talked about what the consequences would be. We talked about what the stakes would be. We knew that there might be retaliation. That certainly has happened. We've seen that with the invasion of our plaza. We knew that there would be retaliation in terms of funding cuts. And of course, that happened not just to us, but it happened to institutions across the country. The last point that I'll make, that I'll leave with this, is that, we have to be so careful as cultural institutions that, we have to understand that the most significant risk to our space is not a single action. We know that authoritarianism doesn't happen overnight. But we also have to really guard against the normalization of this. So, it's the normalization of caution, the normalization of silence, the narrowing of the civic space. And I think that what we also have to really guard against, and which is really one of the most insidious and dangerous things, is this idea of self-censorship. That just be a little bit more cautious, et cetera, and that things will go away, and things don't go away. And the more we do that, the more we actually shrink that space, and we shrink the ability of us as cultural institutions to be able to stand up in that, in the space of freedom of expression and freedom of association, which is so critical to all of us. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I will hand back to you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing some of your responses at the JANM this past year, and for your amazing leadership in that space. Without further ado, I'd love to welcome to the Zoom stage Yomaira. You want
Thank
to
you.
share some more about CENTRO and sort of how you've been dealing with censorship pressures and calibrating them in this moment?
Absolutely. And I will start sharing. Can you all see my screen here? Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Yomaira Figueroa, and it has been so wonderful. Thank you, Anne, for kicking us off with such a beautiful meditation on the important work that you are doing, both in Los Angeles, but also globally, because that work that you're doing in the museum spreads out. That courage really does shore up so many of us. And I'm sorry, I have a cough drop here. I have a little bit of a cold. And so in order to do this, I have to have the cough drop. So apologies. So I want to thank you. Which way forward? And I want us, as a tried and true scholar and academic, I'm going to start us with, I'm gonna guide us through my own thoughts on the question of world building, self-determination, and solidarity through two poets and a writer. So I'm going to start with a poem by Wendy Rose, who is a Hopi Miwok poet. who actually also went to UC Berkeley. And I read and first started reading and teaching Wendy Rose as a graduate student at Berkeley in my comparative ethnic studies courses when I was teaching undergrads. And for me, this poem has always remained so important, and I bring it up often, and I think about it often. And for me, this is going to guide me in talking and going through these points of this conversation. So the title is called "For the Complacent College Students Who Don't Think That People Should, quote, live in the past." And I can't help to think about all of those college students at Doge who were in there deleting, right? Denying funding just willy-nilly with no real context, right? People shouldn't live in the past. It made me think of that. But I'll begin. Do you see that when they kill the ivy on the old brick wall, first they slice their knives through the roots, hardly bother with the leaf and stem, much less the vanity of small white flowers. Oh, shh. Sorry, y'all, my dog, 1 second. Oh my goodness. He was very quiet for Anne. She was very quiet for Anne, but not for me. Hardly bother with the leaf and stem, much less the vanity of small flowers, but pull apart the whole body from the base. Just one lethal cut is all it takes. And if someone thinks the flowers were pretty and picks them, it is not to save them nor preserve their seeds, but just to have them pressed and dried into shadows of themselves, or be found later and identified from a book, cataloged and thoroughly studied, or thrown away in the trash as if they had never lived except on display. And you wonder at the name your mother's mother wore, at the wagon or sailing ship she rode, the horses she saddled, the faces she touched, the baby she bore, the baby she buried, the fever breaking like glass in her heart, the terrible stretch to the breaking of her. And now you wonder if you are she and she is you, shadow of her or shadow of you, prayer or prophecy or mere suggestion of who you might have been, with ancestors plucked, pressed, and dried in a book, roots removed, the woman's face you never knew that you rub with warm water in the morning. This poem makes me think so much about the work of museums and galleries, the work of art, the work of history, the work of archives that bring us so close to a past that we may or may not know, that conjure memory and violence and promise and purpose, and a memory that both in academic institutions as well as arts institutions and federal institutions, we are asked to forget, to cut away at the root, to make ourselves new, to make ourselves different, to learn and to adapt to a different kind of history, to remake our ethics in a world that is not our own making, right? And so for me, Wendy Rose's poem from her collection, Going to War with All My Relations, becomes such a powerful statement to consider what it would mean for us to reject the cutting of the root, reject the cutting of the memory, reject the plucking of the flower, to stop thinking about our pasts, right? As something that can be cataloged, indexed, and put away into a book, but actually can be a living history that can make possible different kinds of futures and different calculuses of our past, right? And so I start with Wendy Rose as a way to think about the exhibition Diasporic Collage, Puerto Rico and the Survival of a People, which is a show, an exhibition that I co-curated with a team of folks from Michigan State University when I was faculty there, as well as the University of Puerto Rico, as well as many of the students that I mentored and we mentored as part of the Diaspora Solidarities Lab project. I want to talk about this experience because it was an early censorship experience in 2024. When we were having an opening for this exhibit that was multiple years in the making, 7 years in planning and 3 years in execution with funding from the Mellon Foundation. And I have talked about this exhibition in many ways, but what I wanted to do, and I thought this might be the best way because I feel like I can get lost in the rage and the angst and the memory of it all, but I'm going to read to you the statement that I wrote of the cancellation because I think it really encapsulates in a very brief way, briefer than I think I can do here, what happens. And then I'll move on from there. This statement is also printed in the catalog that we printed for the exhibition. And this catalog was also something that was attempted, that the museum attempted to censor as well. They did not want these materials in this catalog, and they refused to carry the catalog in their museum. Statement on the cancellation of the MSU Broad Art Museum opening event and the censorship of Diasporic Collage, Puerto Rico and the Survival of a People exhibition. September 18th, 2024. This morning, my co-curators and I were informed of a decision that came down from MSU upper administration and university leadership regarding the Diasporic Collage exhibition. The mandate was that Diasporic Collage would have to be adapted, or rather censored. Specifically targeted is the piece by Alia Farid, Piquete en el Capitolio, based on a 1973 archival photograph from a Puerto Rican newspaper, El Mundo. This piece was actually acquired by the museum on October the 3rd, 2023. After we had presented the exhibition, they loved 3 of the pieces by Puerto Rican women in this exhibit, and they purchased it for the museum. On October 7th, just 4 days later, they changed their tune and then had been asking us from that time until the opening of the exhibit to consider replacing that image. We had said no, and the planning went as usual, right? We went on as regular. This piece was moved to a less visible wall where it would not be seen from the entrance, even though it was not directly visible from the entrance to begin with. In addition to this, it was required that additional text be added to the entrance of the gallery that held our exhibition, which would serve as a trigger warning and denote that this is a faculty, research, multi-institutional exhibition. And it would have the effect of denoting that this exhibition was in the museum, but not of the museum. And in that way, turning their backs on their own assistant curator who collaborated with me in putting this together. Their curator, Dalina Perdomo Alvarez, they turned their backs to her, and then they began to frame Alia Farid's piece as inherently problematic. To be clear, we objected to this mandate and the fact that the exhibition was, quote, adapted while we were on the conversation with them. We were on the Zoom with them, and they were telling us that this is what they wanted to do. And then at the end of the conversation, they said, this is happening right now. As we're talking, it's done, it's a done deal, right? Furthermore, the sign placed at the entrance of the gallery was irresponsible and reductive in its framing of the exhibit and the piece based on a 51-year-old image at that point. We did not create or approve of that text, that trigger warning that they put directly in front of the doors of the gallery, and we rejected that overreach. Curatorial work is part and parcel of the protected speech, and the design of this exhibit is an expression of academic freedom. Forcing the rearrangement of the exhibit is an act of censorship and the professional work of the curator. What precedent does this set for future exhibitions at the MSU Broad Art Museum and beyond? Can university leadership modify the intellectual productions and curatorial works of its faculty and staff without curatorial discussions and approval? This exhibition was so deeply researched and meticulously prepared over the course of 1.5 years. When we actually got the gallery date from that day forward, 1.5 years, we just worked on it. And that's not even counting the many years before when we were in conversations about this piece, about this exhibit. So it completely dismisses the research and the work of the exhibition, to say nothing of the history of the MSU Broad Art Museum as a place that was dismissive of the work of artists and curators of color, which is also reflected in the fact that this exhibition was scheduled and rescheduled several times since 2018. The piece by Farid was presented to several university and museum committees, stakeholders, student groups, and faculty, and has had perhaps the most scrutiny of any acquired piece in the history of the museum. All of this work has been dismissed in a one-sided debate. Since we have no direct communication with those making decisions due to their lack of transparency, and there is no accountability for the series of damaging acts by MSU and the Broad Art Museum, we must resign to writing this statement and outlining our disgust with this treatment of our exhibition, the artists, our intellectual labor, and our community. If we cannot counter the demands being made by the university leadership, we are demanding that additional wall text and signage be added to reflect the censorship of the curator's work, the non-consensual changes made to the exhibition, and how this infringes on academic freedom and artistic expression. We want this text and signage to be added before the gallery is open to the public. We also demand that the MSU administration publicly apologize for the blatantly racist and unwelcoming atmosphere that our artists, community members, and contributors endured on Friday, September 13th, 2024 at the Broad Art Museum. This is when we were expecting 550 people who had registered, including an outside pavilion, to open this exhibit as well as two other exhibits, all by women of color at the museum. And when I arrived to Detroit, Michigan, landed from New York City, I was told that that opening would be canceled. We were lied to when we were told that the cancellation of the event was not about the content of any of the exhibitions, but rather about the staffing and the capacity of the institution. Too many RSVPs, we can't hold that many people. We demand accountability for the cancellation of the event and the lack of transparency around the decision to do so, as well as for how our group, comprised of primarily people of color, were forced to use the service entrance of the museum during that opening night. And many more were turned away at that door. While the primarily white visitors, donors, board members, as well as other patrons and busloads of students from the Midwest were allowed to use the front entrance of the museum, all for in a museum that was quote unquote closed. And here you can see photos of us in this opening where we demanded on the day that they must let us in. But they were already going to allow these groups of white people and donors to enter the museum, but they were going to bar us from coming in, as well as cancel the openings of the other shows because we found out 5 days later of this one piece in our show. As the curator of the Diasporic Collage, and as the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and as the PI of the grant that produced this exhibition, I demanded accountability and a full reimbursement of all costs associated with traveling, lodging, honoraria, and fees for all the stakeholders, as well as all associated costs with the exhibition. I demanded transparency, and I said to them, we should know where these concerns came from and who brought them to the administration so that we can have a necessary open dialogue that this situation requires. If one person or persons can appeal to the university leadership in secret and trigger this level of censorship, and we are in turn put in the position of being censored, dismissed, diminished, publicly shamed, and embarrassed, then there can be none of the open dialogue and communication that the administration says that they so deeply desire. Why has our community of scholars not been invited to a conversation in the wake of these irresponsible decisions? The culture of a university and of a museum, in fact, is set by its administrators. The administration says that they're intent in creating spaces for conversation and communication, but this cannot happen through these forms of censorship, labeling, and dismissive treatment. I am unconvinced that productive conversations can be had when the researchers, curators, faculty, funders, and graduate students who helped to produce the show were not consulted at any time during the making of these decisions. This is a disrespectful and cowardly university that hides its hands as it throws a stone, right? The postscript of this is that in the wake of these events, we had many conversations where we brought university administrators, including the provost, as well as folks who were deans and chairs and funders to a conversation to discuss what actually happened that evening of the opening of Diasporic Collage and the wide range of disrespect that our community faced. We engaged in a series of conversations with the university and the staff, and we were able to receive a full restitution of the exhibition, as well as a commitment for additional support of all of my graduate students who worked on the exhibit received an extra year of full funding with just clear fellowship funding. We also were able to reimburse every single artist and family member of those artists that traveled to Michigan from Puerto Rico, from California, from New York City, from Ohio, from Chicago. Everyone was reimbursed for that. We also demanded a $40,000 community microgrant fund to be established by Michigan State University, which for me is pennies. It's a pittance amount of money. But they agreed. And so they created this fund. And with the support and the expertise of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, those funds were redirected to community organizations across the United States. And for me, that's just the beginning, because this exhibition then made its way to New York City, where we had a proper opening for our community, where we brought in all the artists as well to welcome them. And now it is in Chicago, and from there it will go to Puerto Rico. For me, this was one of a deep moment of fear. And I wanna say, like, I read the statement that I wrote, and I wrote it with lots of rage in that moment, and I could be all bravado, but so the reality is that I was outside of MSU in that moment. I had been a faculty member there, had been arranging for that exhibition there, but I had then moved on to this administrative role at the City University of New York. And I had still, had this connection to this exhibit, was still organizing it. And so I could sit from my position, tenured full professor, director of the largest research center at CUNY, and say all these things. And I will say that it was important for me to speak out in particular. And you can see here in this photo here, this is one of the artists who made the Mundillo. This is the curator, Wendy Cosme, who's from the University of Puerto Rico, and Dalina, who's the local curator at the Broad Museum, which since this exhibition has been facing incredible amounts of bullying, right? And lots of disrespect at her institution. And I'm happy to speak on it because I think it's also about our positions of power, right? From my position, I was able to say these things and I was able to demand certain restitution. But I do know that in fighting back, the ramifications are wide. And one of the ramifications of us demanding justice is that someone that's in a weaker position is facing a very difficult work situation, right? With these institutions that are unrelenting, right? In the ways that they want you to acquiesce to their demands. For me, this is so much about language. And so this is an image of the exhibition at CENTRO. And so this is so much about language, and it's about policing what it is that we do, who we are, and how we speak to ourselves in the present, and how we speak to each other about the past, right? And it makes me it makes very clear to me, and actually I have this a little bit out of order, so this is supposed to be in this order. So it makes me think about the work of Ngugi Tiongo, the late Kikuyu writer and thinker, who in his 1986 text, Decolonizing the Mind, began with a treatise on language, right? He tells us that the choice of language and the use to which language is put is central to a person's definition of themselves in relation to the natural and social environment. Indeed, in relation to the universe itself, right? Or to the entire universe. He talks about colonialism, right? And these forced mandates of our modern world, right? Our capitalist world system that we're living in a moment. And the demands to change our language and to change our cosmologies and our thinking as a cultural bomb. He says that in the attempt to police our language, in the attempt to police the way we think about ourselves, the way that we might engage in solidarity with others, we are buying into the power structures are actually trying to make us think of our past as a wasteland of non-achievement, right? So to not recognize our past, to not celebrate the things that we have gone through, is to give in to what he calls the cultural bomb, right? Your past is a wasteland of non-achievement. And the idea of liberation, of resistance, of speaking back is a remote and ridiculous dream, right? And so museums and galleries, public art spaces, archives, and these other kinds of institutions, both public, private, and community-based, provide us spaces, cracks, right, in this larger system that is attempting to be all-encompassing, that is attempting to discipline us into how we should think and what we should do and how we should move and who we should be in solidarity with, right? These are the spaces where community gets to meet each other eye to eye and understand themselves and one another. I'll never forget one of the most powerful experiences I had was taking my mother, who, born and raised in rural Puerto Rico, to her first museum visit in 2020. We drove to Chicago, no, 2021. We drove to Chicago to see Forecast Forms at the MCA, and I went through the exhibit through every single piece of this giant Caribbean and exhibition. And she asked me questions about every single piece. My mother, who studied up to the 8th grade, right? Who was like, well, what does this mean? What about this? Well, this is what I heard that Haitians do X, Y, Z. And I'm like, well, let me explain to you, right? And there was a moment where they saw one piece, and it was a palm tree, an enormous palm tree, life size, lynched, hanging from the ceiling of that museum. And my mother and her husband stopped in their tracks. And first her husband said, well, that's not how that goes. That should go in the ground. I don't know why they have it hanging up there. Very, very countrified folks, my folks, And then all of a sudden my mother stood next to me and she whispered to me and she said, they're so brave. They are so brave. I can't believe that the artist would do this, right? She herself was scared, right? That the artist had made this particular statement because I read to her and translated for her the wall text, right? And we talked about how this has to do with the IMF and this has to do with Caribbean tourism. This has to do with a reflection of the way that Caribbean life, right, is actually lynched up in this modern system. And it took my mother's breath away that could correlate with this, right? And all of a sudden, I saw the kind of language of power shift in her mind. It was a beautiful moment. And she hasn't stopped asking me about different museums and different things that we're doing. She even came to the Diasporic Collage exhibition. But even as museums are sites of possibility, we also know that they are sites of terror. And this is the actual slide that was supposed to go to. So just this summer, I was in Puerto Rico and I got a phone call from the CEO and director of the National Puerto Rican Museum of Arts and Culture in Chicago in Humboldt Park. Um, and they had let us know, and they were reaching out to their community partners, letting us know that Homeland Security and ICE had decided to set up shop in their parking lot and had used the guise of having to use the restroom to come in and survey. This was preparation for them because they were getting ready to have a series of Latino-inspired festivals, the Puerto Rican Festival, the Colombian Festival, as well as a few other celebrations over the summer. And the folks at the National Museum saw this as an intimidation tactic, right? And they quickly mobilized their community, both within Humboldt Park and in Chicago, but even outside, right, of the state of Illinois, to respond, right? Press release, ensuring to get them out of the museum, saying, this actually it doesn't actually touch us because we're Puerto Ricans, we're US citizens. You can come here all day long, but you know what you're not going to do? You're not going to use this museum or any of our space to terrorize our community. And for me, this was perhaps one of the most powerful shows, right, of their radical solidarity with their community. This is a community that has always been deeply invested in, the Puerto Rican history of Chicago, but also has always been deeply in solidarity with Mexican American, Palestinian, right, American, as well as other communities of color in Chicago. For me, they are like a beacon of how museums should behave in times of crisis, right? And this has become increasingly important as this museum is actually going up for national accreditation now, right, for a second time. And so for me, museums being used as sites of power and possibility, as well as by the state, and even in the case of some institutions, by their own leadership as sites of terror and exclusion, are two sides of the same coin, right? We actually need to think critically about the role of our institutions. Who is leading them? What are their beliefs? How do they put their work and their resources, right? Whether that be human resources or space, right? Space resources or even funding on the line in the face of a like fascist, leadership, as well as all of these forms of injustice that seek to put museums right in their crosshairs. So, wait, do I have? Okay, here we go. So, wrong thing. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about when I'm thinking about language is thinking about that moment. So we're dealing with diasporic collage, dealing with that giant fallout. And I know that just in a few months, I'm so big and bad, and I'm talking mean to all of the upper administration at the university, but this exhibition is coming to my university next, okay? So now I got to put my britches on, right? And say I can also go and defend this in the face of my own institution. And so we had to do that work as well as at the same time I'm leading CENTRO. And so we have this moment of having to think about, well, what does the content of our website say? What do we say about ourselves? And are any of the words that we use to describe the work that we have done for the past 53 years in the kind of bank of banned words that some adolescents and some Neanderthals in Doge and at the White House decided were banned, right? And so I took some screenshots here of our website and the way that we talk about ourselves. And what we found was that in the face of this censorship and in the face of folks really thinking about, do we scrub, do we clean, do we remove, do we edit, we found that we had nothing to change. We actually had nothing to scrub, right? On our site. So here, about us. Founded in 1973 by a coalition of students, faculty, and activists, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies is the largest university-based research institute, library, and archive dedicated to the Puerto Rican experience in the United States, and it's also in the world, right? We provide support to students, scholars, artists, members of the community at large and beyond New York. We produce original research, films, books, educational tools, and are the home of the Central Journal, the premier academic journal of Puerto Rican Studies, which is turning 40 very soon. Our aim is to create actionable and accessible scholarships to strengthen, broaden, and reimagine the field of Puerto Rican studies. Our vision, developing a shared vision for CENTRO, was and continues to be a collective process. We will continue to expand our efforts to collect, preserve, and provide access to archival and library resources, documenting the history and the culture of Puerto Ricans. But we must do it in broader and inclusive ways to be able to integrate support, and encourage interdisciplinary research in new emerging subjects that are traditionally invisible to researchers, as well as emerging issues that are dramatically changing our lives and ways of living today. And then we talk about our history, right? Rooted in the the political projects of the 60s and the 70s. The origins of CENTRO were collaborative and community facing. Among its founding principles was the desire to take the mystery and oppression out of learning, to bring the community into the university, and to, quote, project the university outward in new ways. The formula was radical and necessary. CENTRO called for radical changes to the way the academia conducts itself, views itself, how it recognizes and assigns leadership. It was clear that many of the founders that the production of knowledge about Puerto Ricans in the diaspora must be guided and responsive to our community's needs, right? So this is just some of the language that we use to talk about ourselves. And we have then at the end, right, true to the struggles in this moment, right? True to the struggles that created the conditions for CENTRO, we seek to link scholarship to social action, policy debates, and to contribute to the betterment of our community and enrichment of Puerto Rican studies. What we realized in doing a crawl, like a deep crawl of all of our materials, was that the CENTRO's founding mission, its values, its purpose, and its outlook, even though we understand that just by being Puerto Rican, we are like, in the crosshairs of this administration, the language on our website did not reflect any of the language that was in vogue, right? In the kind of moment of racial reckoning, in the post 2014, in the post 2020, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? All of the language that came, all the social justice terms that were then codified to signal, right? Like to signal a particular kind of politics and ethics. None of that language was actually part of what we were doing, because what we were doing was already rooted in a deeper history, right? And I think that what became really important in talking to some of my colleagues and peers at other institutions was trying to thread it for those that did find themselves in that place where they're like, well, we're not going to get rid of this. We have to change that. We can't say diversity. We can't say blah, blah, blah. I was urging them, dig a little bit deeper. What do you actually mean when you're saying this? What was this word a catch-all for you, right? And if it was just a catch-all, then maybe you should have abandoned it a long time ago, right? Because we need to figure out what we're fighting for, not just in the good days when there's plenty of funding for diversity and for all the key words that we like, but in the bad times where folks who had already been doing that work for decades were doing it without the ability to get the funding that we were able to get in that little pocket of time, right? And so for me, doing this work is about doing this ongoing dialogue in community. It's an ongoing dialogue that is also part of our memory keeping, right? And our memory keeping is so important in terms of how we conceive of the future possibilities of our communities and our families. And so I'm thinking about this work across institutions. And again, I love that Anna and I are talking from different positions. Me from working within university institutions and museums and galleries within those institutions, right? And Anne from having to be the person out in front, right? There's no one really, I mean, the board, right? But like, these are different facets. These are refracting differently, right? Like these events, these like political events that are ongoing, right? Catastrophic events of war, right? Which is what our nation is known for, founding itself and continuing war endlessly, becomes so important for us to contend with. But it's also kind of an ongoing script in the background. Even in the good times, right? We're worried about when the other shoe is going to drop. But in these times, it's so important for us to dig deep and to think about these moments and possibilities for solidarity across difference, right? I'm going to end with just a little stanza of this poem by Ángela María Dávila, who is an Afro-Puerto Rican poet, or who was. This is from her collection Animal Fiore y Tierno, which CENTRO just translated, and we just published through our press a bilingual edition of her very important book from 1977, Fierce and Tender Animal. And she says in this part, con el recuerdo al hombro, pero fíjense que muchas trampas hondas nos detienen y cómo con la onda nos movemos y nos vemos aquí. Memory is slung over my shoulder, but hey, isn't it something? How many deep snares stop us, and how with the deep we move and find each other here. The finding of each other here is a promise. It truly is a promise. And perhaps it is in our institutions, our museums, our galleries, our archives that we can find each other over and over again and remap and rethink everything that we've been told about each other and to get to learn each other, right? in new ways that could radically remap our futures and the possibilities for just life, right? And a good life on this planet. So just want to say thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Yomaira. Thank you, Anne. Next, I would like to turn it over to our Executive Director, Lee Rowland, who in the past year, NCAC has been sought after by a couple of other cultural institutions for advice and feedback for how to deal. And Lee's given some great talks about it, which is why I'm excited to welcome her here. Hi, Lee.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And with all depth of feeling and sincerity, thank you so much to Anne and Yomaira. I have found myself recently in far too many coalitions and conversations that involve fundamental questions about autocracy and the rule of law, as you might imagine in these times. And many scholars of authoritarianism have now joined, right, advocacy conversations in the United States. And all of them have echoed that although we have a limited number of case studies of countries that have rescued themselves from the slide of autocracy, that when it happens, it is not the courts, it's not the legislature, and of course, it's never the executive, right? The aspirational autocrat. It's civil society that keeps our values intact, that refuses to forget, right? And offers us this vision of freedom. And I think if American culture is going to survive with that level of independence, it's going to survive because of leaders like the two of you. So a genuine thanks for kind of giving us an applied case study of how you can stay true to your mission in these incredible times. I do want to be quick because I feel like you two were both so rich. I want to make sure that there's time for conversation. So I'm not going to use slides, and I may talk a little quickly, but I want to go over a few recent events at institutions that have responded differently from both how CENTRO and JANM have responded to this moment. So hopefully we can pull out some lessons. The first is, as both of you have beautifully illustrated, that everything is about mission, right? We are talking about cultural institutions that are something other than just naked capitalism, right? We don't have shareholders just concerned with profit. We are here for principle, a core mission to remember, right? And to share culture. And there are institutions that have experienced very similar pressures to these institutions, as so many have, that have responded in ways, I think, that have really fairly called into question how much they're tethered to their mission. The first, which is so well known at this point, is the Smithsonian. And really one of the first attacks on the Smithsonian echoed so much with some of your comments, Yomaira, about the exhibition, because the first real attack from the Trump administration related to a painting by the artist Amy Sherman called Transforming Liberty, which was a depiction of the Statue of Liberty as a Black trans woman. And in response to the Trump administration's pressure that this would constitute a, quote, illegal DEI, and I'm using shorthand and an eye roll because, of course, the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion are words that we should say unapologetically and, of course, are not illegal in any manner. And what the director of the Smithsonian chose to do was tell the artist that the Smithsonian would be putting up non-consensual wall text, bringing a different point of view to the question of what being transgender means. We all know that that's code for something horrifically transphobic. And Amy Sherman rightly pulled out of that exhibit. And we at the NCAC praised her for refusing to allow her show to basically be manipulated into something that included this non-consensual text. Now, the Smithsonian presumably did this, and we know they did this, even though the leadership has been fairly tight-lipped publicly, on the idea that they would avoid scrutiny of the federal government, which supplies much of its money, even though the institution is independent, right? And I think the first lesson I want to pull out from that is capitulation will not save you. The entire idea, right, of a mission-based organization agreeing to a wall text that wasn't selected by curators or art experts, but rather by politicians seeking to enforce a monoculture of their own, is that you would avoid further scrutiny. Nothing could be further from the truth. That is like, as a good friend of mine has eloquently said, giving the bully your lunch money and assuming they won't come back to you. To the contrary, capitulation really communicates that you are a soft target. And that's exactly how the Trump administration has continued to treat the Smithsonian, including just 3 months ago, announcing a full-scale review of all their holdings to eliminate anything they thought was overly woke. All right. So that's the first big lesson, is that these two women and their institutions are profiles in courage, without a doubt. But there is also a little bit of irrationality baked into the idea that if we just capitulate, we'll avoid the eye of the censor, right? It's just not true. And we see it time and time again. In major contrast, there is a similarly situated group called Voice of America. It is federally funded. It is set up to be an independent broadcast media that is funded by the government but has editorial independence. The Trump regime attempted the exact same dominion and takeover of Voice of America as it did with the Smithsonian, and the Voice of America staff and board's response was the polar opposite. They refused to capitulate, and much like Janum, they put out a wide statement with much support saying this undermined their core ideals and that they would fold before allowing themselves to be turned into a tool of propaganda. The Trump administration is still coming for Voice of America, but just last month, in league with several press freedom advocacy groups, their board members and key staff, they filed a lawsuit under the First Amendment challenging the Trump administration's continual attempts to come at them. And in their lawsuit, and I'll put the link in a chat in a moment, they said, and I'm quoting from their complaint, "The administration, acting through defendants, has censored the news coming out of Iran. Interviews, video footage, and stories about anti-government protests within Iran have been suppressed. Reporting on elements in opposition to the Iranian regime have been banned from VOA's Persian service. All of this, along with unlawful manipulation of VOA, detailed below, is antithetical to the tradition of press freedom that has marked America since its founding, and it undermines VOA's ability to earn its audience's trust, which is critical to fulfilling VOA's core mission." Now, in contrast to the Smithsonian, they made a very different choice. They did not invite death by 1,000 cuts by agreeing to one small editorial change or one agreement not to publish a story on Iran. They held the line, much like these institutions have too. And they are likely, I think, to not only survive this moment, but survive and thrive with their mission intact, which I don't think I could say for the Smithsonian. So it's really important to, especially for leaders in cultural institutions, actually think through the kind of bizarre, almost chess or wartime logics of the censor, which is not to become a soft target, and that staying true to your mission is itself a way to survive, because our existence as cultural institutions depends on our mission, right? We're not selling widgets. We are upholding culture. And so I think in the stories that you've just heard from Anne and Yomaira, there are a couple of the tips I would offer you, also looking at the Smithsonian and Voice of America as an incredible contrast in responding to this pressure. And it is all about having an internal, firm, and communicated sense of mission, what your red lines are, anticipating the pressures that will come, and deciding what changes, if any, you are willing to make. It might be scrub nothing, right? That may be so core to your mission of memory, it's nothing. Or it may be, you know what? We are going to decide to do some tactical changes, but we are not going to do it in a way that we think eliminates one single word that matters at heart to our people, to the people we serve, our community, as Yomaira explained. So I think here, the real key is for institutions to make sure that mission permeates every board of directors member or trustee. Every employee who is hired and onboarded gets a sense of why you are there, what makes you tick, what is your core mission. And if you can do that, if you have policies internally that prevent, say, someone with influence from taking off that mission, If you have boards of directors that understand that their first and primary objective is to establish and further that mission, you have a chance, right, to survive this moment. And the last thing I'll say is, cowardice is contagious. And I think we heard elements in both of your stories, right, about people looking to others and saying, oh, well, they didn't stand up. And much like Yomaira's mother, I think we all have felt a moment when that courage is contagious too. And so, cowardice is dangerous and it can spread, but we have power as people who are in culture institutions, are enmeshed in the civil society that is going to be, right, the thread that pulls us out of autocracy if we can make it. And that power comes from staying true to that mission and communicating it, to not go gently into that fascist night, right, but to yell and scream and unapologetically defend that mission. Because if we survive, right, that way you have an audience, you have consumers, you have clients, you have people in your community that are with you and want you to thrive because of that very mission. And as consumers of art, by the way, if you are not engaged in an institution and don't have that power, we can use our power as part of the community to give positive feedbacks to institutions like Janum and CENTRO that have stood up for those values, and to make sure for other institutions that don't, that are in your community, either digitally or locally, that we give them that feedback, that that's unacceptable, that too is an existential threat to their existence. That is, that we as consumers tell the Voice of America, we will be with you, and tell the Smithsonian, these are choices that undermine our confidence in the very mission that we thought you stood for. So I just want to end by saying thanks again to both of you, because you both stood up as leading lights of kind of how to not comply in advance. And all of us can learn from that and from the cautionary tales. And collectively together, we've got a chance of keeping those missions intact by refusing to comply in advance.
Thank you so much, Lee. And thank you, Anne and Yomaira, too, for your, again, rich presentations. I know that we are nearing the end of our slated time, and I wanted to ask if you both have time for maybe 2 questions. Yeah, thank you. So as Lee mentioned, obviously there have been financial pressures that threaten the sort of viability of institutions, and also difficult decisions always have to be made in moments like this. I was wondering if you could both talk briefly about the role that your board leadership played in your respective organizations' responses to pressures this past year. How did you broach the subject with your boards in the context of risk or emergency management?
So, I can probably go first and try and answer this quite briefly. We were extraordinarily lucky because we have a very, very courageous board. And that in that first conversation we had with them, literally within 3 days of the inauguration, we came out with a statement, 2 weeks later, but within 3 days, we, took a very hard look at what was at stake. And I think that for our trustees, for all of us, we were not prepared to compromise our mission or the integrity of our work in any way. And for us also was that we could not allow the threat of federal funding to compromise our work. So, for us, it was an unequivocal decision. And what I have to say is we did lose very significant federal funding. It was almost, $750,000, as did everybody else. But what has been enormously important is that our members, the public, even those folks we don't have relationships with, as well as the donor community, has really stood by us and has kind of acknowledged the impact of the positions that we've taken. So it's always hard to lose funding, but it was the right thing to do. And for us, maintaining that integrity and maintaining the credibility of the work that we do was really more important than anything else.
Thank you. And I mean, in my experience, for the things that happened at Michigan State University, we had no support whatsoever from the upper administration. I think the provost had taken it upon himself to make a unilateral decision based on a complaint that he had received. about someone possibly being offended, and decided to end this exhibition. And we really did not receive any support from or any understanding from that position. In fact, they were just like, you just don't understand. We needed a lot more. You needed to do a lot more work on this. You needed a lot. And so we produced and we showed them all the research, and then they just couldn't say anything, right? But we did get a lot of support from the lower administration. That's like from department chairs and other folks, as well as from faculty and students and community members that really put the pressure on the university. At the same time that I was balancing this problem at that university, I had to deal with my own university, where I was running the center and then also, reporting directly to the president and the chancellor of the university, right? So when I knew that this had become a problem at Michigan State University, I turned around, fighting that battle, took a minute to say, hi, y'all. I'm having this huge problem at my old institution where I have all of this money, this grant money parked. The grant is coming here, and guess what? The exhibition is also coming here. I'm so sorry to bring that problem to you here. But I had a conversation with the provost, with the president, and with the chancellor's office, with the chancellor himself, as well as the chancellor of communications. And I just talked candidly about what this was. And it was kind of like a breath of fresh air to talk with them, because they were just like, well, if this is art, and it's also art that is about research, like this is an image from 1973. No, there's no problem with this exhibition. There's absolutely no problem with this. What's going on? There was a little bit of a what are we going to do on the opening night? And some of the folks in upper administration said, well, we support it, but we're not going to come, you know? But then at the end of the day, they were there. And then, they showed up and they were like, you know what? We love it. Everything is fine. And for me, that was really great. So that's for me on the kind of level of like administration to administration around the exhibition. And then when it came to CENTRO, when it came to the conversation about what are we going to do? Do we have to clean this website? The only thing that we actually took off the website were people's emails, their personal, like their direct emails. And so we already were having a situation with some of our researchers who were researching certain areas that were being kind of, there was like that dog whistle out of, DC. And so we had some of our researchers being harassed via email. And so what we decided to do was to take people's emails off, and we just put the kind of general emails that then would just trickle down into people's inboxes. But then when we sat together, like when we had that conversation about photos, about emails, we also had the conversation about the website, and we sat with the executive team of CENTRO, the team leaders, as well as the communications team. And we realized, again, that moment where we were, oh, there's nothing really here. Like none of this is actually going to touch us. So you know what? We're not going to, and even if there was, I don't think we would have changed anything, right? Like that's the thing. It's like, it was a little bit of both ways, which is like, I was also had to be convinced that like people's emails had to be taken off. I was kind of being a little stubborn. I was like, nah, whatever. And then they were like, listen, relax. Some people are just, don't feel as strongly as you do about having their personal email out. And I was like, okay, got it. I understand, But it was something that we were facing in direct result of the losses that we were facing, because immediately we lost our earmark, our NEH, our NARA grant, the National Endowment for the Arts grant. They wanted to we had to quickly wrap up and spend that money before the end of the fiscal year. We lost a little bit over $400,000 in federal funding. And we've applied since then, obviously, to so many things. Because I think part of one of the conversations that we had at the NCAC in one of those workshops was, now that we see this new call for all of these new grants, do we keep applying? And I think that at that table with all the folks, like, yeah, we're going to keep applying because we're just going to, you know what I mean? Like, we're going to, even though they're not going to give it to us, the work continues, right? And so for me, that has been the kind of important part, which is like leaning on the folks at CENTRO, and especially the leadership that has been there. I have my director of operations has been there since the early 90s. He's been there for 35 years, and he's worked with every single director of CENTRO. He came in at the tail end of the first director term. And so that institutional knowledge is invaluable, right? And that institutional force where this is someone who has seen things, right? And he's like, okay, I know what this looks like. Let me just orient you in terms of which way this is going to go. And for me, that being able to rely on that beautiful group of leadership, and they're also so insurgent and so committed to the mission. As Lee was saying, it's like, what is the mission? Are you committed to it? Like, are you going to change it now? Is that the thing? Became so important. And it really I feel like it rooted my feet even deeper. And, we say estamos puestos para la pelea. Like, I'm ready for the fight. Like, I'm ready, like I came in with the ocean waves. I came with the high tide, and I'm ready for the fight. And so that's how I think, and I don't know if you feel the same way, when you have that strong board behind you, you're like, I'll take anyone down. Let's go. Like, if you got a question, I have an answer. Okay. And I have like 12 answers. So take a seat. We're going to be here all day. right? And so for me, that is the power of community that believes in this together. So you're never going to be alone in that. Yeah. So.
So true. I know that it can be so alienating. I know a lot of leaders that I've spoken to in the last year have felt very isolated, siloized, and finding moments where we can share sort of different challenges and the ways in which that we overcome them by having support from our peers, both within the institution and outside, is such a valuable resource under these conditions that we're in right now. I know that we're 7 minutes past when we said we would close, and so I think I might just leave it there. I'm so grateful for everybody's contributions and the reflections on which we've sort of landed on, which are the commitments to mission, commitments to purpose, commitments to the communities that we serve, and the histories and memories that we hold close to our own, to ourselves as like a guidepost with how to move forward, how not to forget, and how to honor the struggles of those before us. So with that, thank you all, and thank you for being part of this with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much.